So, Heather, when we broke, you were making the point that Clinton has not been running a stay the course. We're just going to keep things going, but rather the Democratic primary was about going further, going more in a progressive direction. We've seen the platform, which Bernie Sanders calls the most progressive Democratic platform perhaps ever, but certainly in a reversal of where we've been for the past 30 or 40 years. And finish that thought, because I want to talk more about that.
Well, I mean, I think, as I said, and you know this, and so do I'm sure all your listeners. I mean, this, as I said, this faction of the Democratic Party has been gaining in strength for some time. It is now a much bigger part, actually, of the Democratic Party than, say, the evangelical voters are of the Republican Party. It's a big group that must be dealt with and cannot be ignored. If nothing else, this campaign has shown that they cannot be ignored. So, I think that it is interesting that this is happening now. I'm not quite sure how successful it would have been, or I shouldn't say how successful. I'm not sure it would have been as successful if, as you mentioned earlier, Clinton had been up against, say, I don't know, Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or some more mainstream Republican than Trump. But she didn't know that at the time that she was shifting throughout the campaign. Or at the very least, I mean, I don't even know where her heart is. It doesn't really matter. But it does matter that she strategically did adopt many of these, issues that were important to the progressive wing, and maybe they're important to her too. But as time went on, she took that chance, even though she may, who thought Trump was going to win? I mean, maybe you and I did, but not very many people did. So, she was taking a risk in doing that, but it was a risk she had to take because the Democratic Party was churning with these issues. So, it's very interesting. I think I have to give the Democrats a little bit of credit. And this isn't very popular.
I know you do that reluctantly, as I do, but go ahead.
Well, they're politicians, so who wants to give them credit for anything? But nonetheless, when these opportunities present themselves, as I felt like in 2008, after Bush had screwed the pooch so badly with Iraq and everything else. I mean, he was at a 25% approval rating. The Democrats took advantage of that moment, and they basically said, we're going to make a change here. We're going to actually elect someone that in not very long ago would have been considered an absurd idea, the idea of the first African-American president. The first woman was on the in the campaign as well, hard fought, almost made it. So they took advantage of that opportunity to make that change. This time, I think they're doing the same thing, which is that as they're watching the Republicans, absolutely crumble and, basically blow themselves up in many ways, they're taking advantage of that opening to push this more liberal agenda. I mean, I know that's not a popular thing to say, but I actually think that if you wanted to look at many of the Democrats in the leadership, not just Clinton, but, people like Sherrod Brown or Tammy Baldwin or Elizabeth Warren. I mean, there are a lot, and thanks in some respects to this progressive movement that's been working very hard over the past decade to get these people in office. There's now a group of people within the government, within the party itself, who are, at least to some degree dedicated to this more progressive agenda. And, you saw that with the Social Security issue, expansion. I mean, that didn't come out of a think tank. That came out of some grassroots organizing that actually brought that to the forefront and has now been adopted by the Democratic Party. And that's the kind of thing, I think, that I have to give them a little credit for. They're not... In the past, they have run from that stuff. They were scared. And now they seem to be going.
I will say this. I mean, whether or not it was a complete function of they's agency, if you were, and they in quotes, that seems to be what happened. I mean, if you had told me 8 years ago, 10 years ago, when I would interview Sherrod Brown, congressman from Ohio, and Bernie Sanders, congressman from Vermont, that these two would be chairs, potentially, of the most powerful committees in the Senate. And they would also be allied with basically another liberal lion, if you will, from Massachusetts. I would have told you you're crazy based upon what was going on there. I mean, and one thing that really makes that clear, well, just to stay on this point, and then we'll get to Evan Bayh in a moment, but that Hillary Clinton, she got, in some ways, she's definitely taking advantage of the Trump situation, because this is not going to be an ideological campaign.
Right.
Trump is not capable of waging an ideological campaign. And Clinton could have easily sort of looked at this situation and said, now's the time for me to tack to the center in some ways. I don't think she's going to do that, because I think her assessment of what the climate is such that it behooves her, even to be the most cynical perspective on it, it behooves her to keep coming out with these proposals. And, I guess we'll find that out, as we enter into the DNC a week from now. But it's a fascinating time. It's an election of the likes we have not ever seen, at least in my life, in modern time, because we're actually watching one where they don't seem to be coming out of their corners, if you will. And it's interesting.